Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of History Comes Alive. Today we're concluding our three-part series on the history of Pennsylvania, the Keystone story. Hope you've enjoyed it to date. I've had some wonderful feedback from my viewers, and before I forget, I do want to mention a note of appreciation to Terry Webb, who sent me a fabulous little booklet. She's a noted historian and worked out in the Pittsburgh area and sent me a little monograph here on, there you go, Imagine Pittsburgh Back When. So if any of you are from the Pittsburgh area, you might want to look for that book, and lots of others out there, of course, on the internet. So today we're looking at the 20th century, the new century in Pennsylvania, bringing us up as well to current events. And I'll talk about this image on the screen later on, but for now, it stands, I guess, as a symbol of the prosperity and progress that we associate with the 20th century in Pennsylvania. But also for Pennsylvanians, the new century saw scandals, wars, depression, later on environmental degradation, racial unrest, industrial decline, but a lot of fun times that we remember as well. And I'll leave us today on an upbeat note as we look at the economic renaissance in Pennsylvania, which bodes well for the future, I think. So back to history. The 20th century began for Pennsylvania with the need for a new Capitol building in Harrisburg. The old one, shown on the left, had been completed in 1822, but as you can see in the other photograph, 1897, destroyed by fire. The replacement for the Capitol was a monument to the Gilded Age. There it is on the left, classic Greek Revival style, 270-foot high dome, modeled after St. Peter's in Rome. The grand staircase in the lobby of the Capitol, I'm sure many of you have been there, echoes the entrance to the Paris Opera. At the dedication of the new Capitol in 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt, shown there on the right, called it the handsomest building I ever saw. But it was later known as the Steal of the Century. The impressive architecture, lavish decorations concealed financial scandal. Every dollar that went into construction was matched by another $2 in padded bills and payoffs. Several dozen state officials got kickbacks from contractors. The architect himself ended up going to jail for graft. Well, despite its shady foundations, the Capitol building is often referred to as a palace of art because of its many sculptures, murals, stained glass windows, most of them created by Pennsylvanians or reflecting themes in Pennsylvania history. Here's a mural entitled Penn's Vision, showing him leading victims of religious oppression to freedom in the new colony. It was painted by the late Victorian artist Violet Oakley, shown there at work on the right. The mural reflected her belief that art should morally uplift the viewer. The state capitol, in fact, is the largest collection of her work in one place. She painted or completed 43 murals in all in the Capitol building. On the ground floor of the Capitol, literally in the floor, are nearly 400 glazed ceramic tiles depicting Pennsylvania heritage. This one shows William Penn on the right greeting the native Lenape Indians. The tiles were created by Henry Mercer. Mercer was born in Doylestown, trained as a lawyer, made lots of money manufacturing pottery and decorative tiles, but his real passion was archaeology. And his interest in early American artifacts led him to build a fascinating museum in his hometown, the Mercer Museum, shown at the left. He fashioned it out of poured concrete and used it to house his personal collection of 40,000 tools and handmade objects, from cigar store Indians to antique fire engines. Henry Ford said that Mercer's museum was the only museum worth visiting in the U.S., apparently inspired Ford's own museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Well, with his interest in arts and crafts, Mercer was not a fan of industrial capitalism, and neither was Ida Tarbell. She was born in Erie County, made a name for herself exposing the evils of unregulated monopolies. Her biggest enemy was J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust. Rockefeller's trust had destroyed her father's independent drilling business during the Pennsylvania oil boom. In 1903, writing for the popular McClure's magazine, Tarbell produced a series of articles exposing the ruthless methods used by Rockefeller to control the U.S. oil market. The cartoon on the right shows her attacking Rockefeller's traditional policy of silence. She is literally smoking out his secrets. Well, her crusading efforts later influenced the Supreme Court in ordering the breakup of Standard Oil in 1906. For that and for other muckraking journalism on economic and social issues, Tarbell is considered a hero of the early 20th century progressive movement in America. Not every business tycoon at the turn of the century was seen as a mercenary tyrant. Milton S. Hershey was the epitome of benevolent capitalism, even paternalistic capitalism. He was born in what is now known as Hershey, launched his first sweet enterprise, the Lancaster Caramel Company, in 1883. He returned to his hometown in 1900, bought farmland, surrounded by an ample supply of dairy cows, and built a huge factory to mass produce what had been a former luxury snack, milk chocolate. Instead of exploiting his workers, he coddled them with low-cost, tax-free housing, health insurance, a retirement plan, new schools, a free junior college, and he also opened an amusement park, shown there on the right, to provide wholesome entertainment during employees' time off. This, of course, evolved into today's Hershey Park. He had no children, but in 1909, he established the Milton Hershey School for Orphans, later opened it up to children from poor and broken families. He left his entire estate to the school, including his majority holding of Hershey chocolate stock. The Milton Hershey School is now one of the wealthiest boarding schools in the country. And I just noticed a couple of weeks ago, a judge in Dauphin County has ruled that the Milton Hershey Trust will be able to build 6 free child care centers around the state for low-income families, because the income to the trust far exceeds the operational needs of the Milton Hershey School alone. Progressive ideas in the early to mid-20th century gave rise to 2 leading lights in environmental stewardship from Pennsylvania. Gifford Pinchot, at the left, was a founder of the modern conservation movement in America. He was born into a wealthy Connecticut family. After studying in France, he became the first professional forester in America. Later on, Teddy Roosevelt appointed him the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. In the 1920s, he served as Pennsylvania's Commissioner of Forests, expanded state-owned forests, improved forest management by controlling fires, helping to replant private lands. He later served 2 terms as governor, and a state park in York County was named in his honor. Rachel Carson, on the right, was born in Allegheny County. She worked as a marine biologist, then became a full-time nature writer. Her 1962 bestseller, Silent Spring, drew attention to ecological harm from the indiscriminate use of pesticides. This led to a nationwide ban on DDT and helped inspire the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Rachel Carson's name is on the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources in Harrisburg. In early 1917, the U.S. was on the road to war. World War I had broken out in Europe in 1914, but America stayed on the sidelines. The tide turned in April of 1917. Continued submarine attacks on American shipping and a German threat to enlist Mexico as an ally forced President Wilson to call for a declaration of war. With the real threat of sabotage in the U.S. and the regular Army severely reduced in size, National Guard units all around the country were called up to enhance domestic security. 4 out of the 14 National Guard regiments in Pennsylvania served on guard duty around the state in the middle of 1917, protecting vital infrastructure. At the left, you can see a National Guard camp set up at the Rockville Bridge. In the background, twice these guardsmen came under sniper fire. And on the right, a photograph from near Williamsport, National Guard sentries posted on a railroad bridge over Lycoming Creek, up in Lycoming County. In July of 1917, all of the Pennsylvania National Guard was mobilized into federal service. Citizen soldiers assembled for rudimentary training at their armories and at tent cities around the state. Photograph on the left is the front page of the Harrisburg newspaper, showing 800 National Guard soldiers from Harrisburg camping out on City Island. In September, the National Guardsmen shipped out by train to Army training camps in the South. The photograph on the right shows Williamsport National Guardsmen leaving for Georgia. They spent the next 6 months getting ready for the serious business of 20th century warfare. And I should point out, today being Veterans Day, this is as good a day as any to pay tribute to not only National Guard soldiers who answered the call during the 20th century, but service members, men and women who've served in all branches during a very turbulent time in American history. And of course, their service and sacrifice continue today. As the National Guard is deploying for World War I, civilians back home did their part. They felt it was their patriotic duty to buy Liberty bonds to help finance the war. Liberty bond sales in York were conducted out of a miniature replica of the old colonial courthouse. There it is on the right. It was called Victory House on the main square in the center of York. Ambitious fundraisers set up a large wooden head of Kaiser Wilhelm next to the Victory House. Patriotic citizens could buy nails at 10 cents each and drive them into the Kaiser's head with a red, white, and blue hammer. A very patriotic effort underway there in York. And in Lancaster and elsewhere, Red Cross membership soared. Red Cross volunteers sold bonds, raised money, sewed surgical dressings and hospital garments. That's what's going on in this photograph on the left side, a workroom sponsored by the Red Cross in the old Woolworth building in downtown Lancaster. Pennsylvania's manufacturers were committed to the fight as well. In World War I, steel mills in Pittsburgh provided 80% of the steel needed for America's tanks, ships, and heavy weapons. Pennsylvania's most impressive industrial operation was the Hog Island Shipyard in Philadelphia, the largest in the world at the time. It had 50 slipways stretching 2.5 miles along the Delaware River. So there's a photograph on the right highlighting the accomplishments. The shipyard, however, did not deliver its first ship until the end of the war. And tragically, as you can see from the sign at the left, the crowded shipyard was a breeding ground for Spanish flu during the great pandemic of 1918. Echoes of the past, even with us today. Philadelphia, in fact, suffered one of the worst death tolls of any city in the U.S. I sent you a handout in advance, sort of chronicling that episode in Philadelphia's history. At the peak of the epidemic in Philadelphia, from late September until early November, 12,000 people died. Funeral parlors were so overwhelmed that victims had to be temporarily buried in mass graves. Pennsylvania soldiers finally reached France in May of 1918, part of a rising tide of Yankees coming to join the Allied effort on the Western Front. The Army had formed the troops of the Pennsylvania National Guard into the 28th Infantry Division, with the distinctive red Keystone shoulder patch shown there on the left. The Germans called this the Bloody Bucket Patch, and in fact, Pennsylvania National Guard soldiers today still wear that same patch very proudly, and I number myself among those veterans of the great Keystone Division. Pennsylvania's greatest contribution during World War I came in the decisive Meuse-Argonne offensive, which ran from late September to the end of the war. Involving over 1 million doughboys, it was the biggest and bloodiest American operation of the war. But it does finally push the exhausted German forces to surrender, November 11th, 1918, 102 years ago today. 371,000 Pennsylvanians served in World War I. As they came home, they were greeted by huge crowds of well-wishers. In many cities, like Williamsport, shown on the left, they marched in parades featuring wood or plaster replicas of the Arc de Triomphe. Generic bronze statues of doughboys cropped up in dozens of towns and villages across the state. The one on the right is in Jefferson in York County, dedicated in 1920, recognizes 22 from the community who served in the war, including 2 who died. On the state level, Pennsylvania's contribution to victory in World War I is celebrated at the 28th Division Shrine in Boalsburg, shown on the right. On Armed Forces Day in May, current members of the division conduct an annual memorial ceremony to honor their fallen comrades. Next door to the shrine is the Pennsylvania Military Museum, well worth a visit. It was built at the height of the Vietnam War, recently renovated to pay homage to the courage and sacrifice of Pennsylvania service members throughout the last 100 years. After the horrors of World War I, Pennsylvanians were ready to be entertained. To meet their needs, 1920 saw the opening of America's first commercial radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, a brainchild of the Westinghouse Electric Corporation to sell war surplus radio receivers. The photograph from 1922 shows the noted humorist Will Rogers with some Ziegfeld girls performing live in the KDKA studio. Later came talking movies, starting with Al Jolson's Jazz Singer in 1927. However, most of the Jazz Singer is actually silent. The first all-talking picture was Jolson's The Singing Fool. Shown on the right, it's the opening feature at the new Capitol Theater in Williamsport in 1928. A decade later, the Roaring Twenties gave way to the Great Depression. Pennsylvanians suffered along with everyone else in the country. The worst time was the winter of 1933, when unemployment in Pennsylvania hit 37%. In many cities, because of the economic malaise, shantytowns sprang up to house the homeless poor. These were called Hoovervilles, in mockery of President Hoover, who did too little, too late to get the federal government involved in the crisis. The photograph on the left is from Pittsburgh, and the train speeding by in the background seems to question the very notion of progress in the 20th century. Rural areas were not immune to the Great Depression. On the right is a photograph of a farm in York County up for auction during the Depression, probably as a result of debts due to falling prices for agricultural production. FDR, who succeeded Hoover, went all out in marshaling federal resources to try to ease the dire economic conditions. To provide jobs for young, able-bodied men, he pushed to create the Civilian Conservation Corps. In Pennsylvania, the Corps literally reshaped the landscape, building roads, replanting cut-over forests, cleaning and improving state parks and historic sites. On the left is a CCC crew planting trees at the Gettysburg battlefield in 1936. And on the right, one of the 9 black-only CCC camps in Pennsylvania. This was in Mifflin County. 9 of the 97 CCC camps in the state were for African American workers only. Another innovative project under the New Deal paid artists to paint murals in post offices. This was an initiative separate from, but related to, the better-known federal art project that hired 10,000 artists, photographers, and sculptors from the period of 1935 to 1943. Under this mural project, 88 murals were created for post offices in Pennsylvania. Most of them can still be seen today. You can find online resources for where to locate them. One colorful example of a post office mural is in Ambler, Pennsylvania. Shows a kind of socially conscious art for the masses, very popular in the 1930s. This mural is entitled "The Family, Industry, and Agriculture," painted in 1939 by Harry Sternberg, who took the artistic liberty to put himself into the scene along with his wife, Mary, and baby daughter there at the bottom. A final legacy of the 1930s is the Pennsylvania Turnpike, America's first long-distance, limited-access highway. It was designed to improve travel over the Appalachian Mountains. You recall from my first presentation how the Appalachians were a barrier to Pennsylvania's economic development for many decades. The Turnpike incorporated 7 abandoned railroad tunnels from the 1880s, which had been originally dug for the Southern Pennsylvania Railroad, which was never completed. The Southern Pennsylvania Railroad was intended to be a rival to the Pennsylvania Railroad. One of its investors was Andrew Carnegie, and he is actually shown in that photograph on the left. You can just make out his beard. He's standing right here. The great Andrew Carnegie at the Rays Hill Tunnel. As I said, he was an investor in this project, never came to fruition, but the tunnels remained there, and they were used by the Turnpike until 1968, when they were bypassed to reduce congestion going through the tunnel. The design features of the Pennsylvania Turnpike were modeled after Germany's Autobahn, designed in the pre-war period in Germany. The initial 160-mile stretch of the Turnpike opened in 1940, ran from Carlisle to Irwin, east of Pittsburgh. Photograph on the left shows the Blue Mountain interchange midway. The Turnpike was finally completed in 1957, running 360 miles from the Delaware River to Ohio, including the Northeast extension. The Turnpike was tremendously popular from the beginning, despite skeptics. At first, there was no speed limit on the Turnpike, and the toll remained a penny a mile for 25 years. Those days are long behind us, of course. Well, World War I proved to be not the war to end all wars. When America went to war again in 1941, Pennsylvania answered the call. More than 1 million Pennsylvanians served in World War II, including, again, mobilized guardsmen from the 28th Infantry Division. They landed in France a month after D-Day, and they took a detour on the way to the front to take part in a parade marking the liberation of Paris from Nazi rule. That parade is shown on the left, and later on that image was featured on a U.S. postage stamp. However, the bombers up here in the sky were added simply for dramatic effect. The greatest trial for the 28th Division came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. This was a last-ditch German effort to punch through the heavily wooded Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies, and force them to accept a negotiated peace. The 28th Division had been posted to a quiet sector in Luxembourg, taken by complete surprise, but courageous fighting by small units of the division, as well as isolated soldiers, helped stall the German advance. During the Battle of the Bulge, there were a lot of war correspondents around Bastogne, Belgium, where the 101st Airborne held out against a German siege until Patton's Third Army came to the rescue. However, there were no reporters in the snow-covered hills of Luxembourg, which is why the bravery and sacrifice of Pennsylvania's sons in Luxembourg have not gotten the attention it deserves. As in World War I, Pennsylvania businesses on the home front rallied to the cause in World War II. The Bantam Car Company in Butler developed the prototype of the Jeep in 1940. But when it came time for the Army to award a contract for mass production, Bantam lost out to two huge firms that had the capacity to crank out several 100,000 Jeeps apiece, Ford and Willis Overland. America's first electronic computer, ENIAC, was built in secret at the University of Pennsylvania, filled an entire room. It was originally planned to calculate artillery firing tables, but the project wasn't completed until 1946, just in time to run mathematical problems related to the hydrogen bomb. Top left is Hershey's D-ration bar, a chocolate compound, shall we say, designed to be high in energy value, easy to carry, resistant to melting. However, the GIs weren't impressed. They hated the bitter taste of the D-ration. They often called it Hitler's secret weapon for its effect on their intestinal tracts. Well, after World War II, Pennsylvanians joined their fellow Americans to share in the rewards of peace and prosperity, suggested here by the gleaming spires of PPG Place in Pittsburgh. But they would eventually face new and often unexpected challenges. Returning veterans found a home for their new families in the suburbs, springing up around Pennsylvania cities. Real estate developer William Levitt built two of his Levitt towns in Bucks County outside Philadelphia. Between 1952 and 1958, Levitt built 17,000 prefabricated houses, like the one shown on the right. Now, these developments were racially segregated, and it was easy to make fun of all the identical little boxes along those streets. But for young people who grew up in noisy, crowded tenements in the city, this was utopia. A returning general settled down to another version of post-war living. Through their long Army career, Dwight Eisenhower and his wife Mamie never had a house to call their own. So in 1950, they bought a rundown farm on the outskirts of Gettysburg, where Eisenhower incidentally had served during World War I. They had the property rebuilt. Mamie was put in charge of the renovations. Ike Eisenhower reportedly told the contractor, "Just give her what she wants and send me the bill." As president, Eisenhower spent most of his weekends and summer vacations relaxing at the farm in Gettysburg. He later donated the property to the National Park Service. Well worth a visit when you're able to get out to the Gettysburg farm of Eisenhower. Brings back wonderful memories of domestic life in the 1950s. Note the bedroom here. It has a TV in it, one of those old console TVs. For ordinary Pennsylvanians, a weekend getaway in the 1950s might involve a trip to the Pocono Mountains. The first resorts opened there in the early 20th century. They became a popular destination for outings by extended families, church groups, labor unions. things were a bit racier at the notorious couples-only resorts in the Poconos. For better or for worse, the heart-shaped bathtub and the whirlpool in the shape of a champagne glass, both invented in the Poconos. Perhaps still there for you to enjoy in the future. But the scene was very different in post-war Pittsburgh. Once admired as emblems of progress and prosperity, the steel mills were increasingly seen as a blight on the environment. In downtown Pittsburgh, polluted smoke turned day into night, as you can see in the photograph on the right. In 1948, a town nearby to Pittsburgh, the town of Donora, was caught by a layer of warm air that trapped emissions from a zinc plant owned by U.S. Steel. What resulted was known as the Great Donora Smog, left half the town's residents sick. 22 died of asphyxiation during this environmental catastrophe. Well, Pittsburgh skies are a lot cleaner now, but we can still see evidence of environmental neglect. In northeastern Pennsylvania, for example, in the ghost town of Centralia. A fire broke out at a landfill in Centralia in 1962. The fire spread to old underground coal mines, defied every attempt to put it out. The escaping gases and the surface damage eventually forced the state to condemn the entire town and pay for the residents to relocate elsewhere. The fire is still burning at Centralia and will burn for the next 250 years at least. One abandoned portion of a state highway through Centralia has attracted hordes of aspiring artists. It became known as Graffiti Highway. Abandoned coal mines and shut down factories were a symptom of a problem that began afflicting Pennsylvania in the 1960s. Problem of deindustrialization, industrial decline. And the photograph offers a powerful symbol of this trend. This is the open hearth facility at the Homestead Works of U.S. Steel, the site of the infamous steelworkers' strike in 1892. The works closed in 1982. Now, U.S. Steel still has operations in Pittsburgh and around the U.S., but its current employment is only 30,000, less than 1/10 the number of workers at U.S. Steel at its peak during World War II. Now, this loss of good-paying union jobs in Pennsylvania has contributed to a stagnant economy, reduced tax base, and migration of young people to more promising states in the West and South. In the last 30 years, Pennsylvania's population only grew by 8% versus 33% in the U.S. as a whole. Pennsylvania, in fact, has the fourth oldest population of any state in the country. This has implications for political influence on the national scene. In the 1950s, Pennsylvania had as many as 33 representatives in Congress. Now, only 18. Although, as we saw last week, those 18 representatives plus our 2 senators gave us 20 electoral votes, obviously quite important in the current political environment. Since the 1960s, periodic urban unrest added to the state's litany of woes. In New York, rioting broke out during the long, hot summer of 1969. The National Guard was, 1969. The National Guard was called in to reinforce the local police. You see an armored vehicle up there on the right. After a white police officer was shot and killed, white militants killed a black woman who was in town from Georgia visiting relatives. The handout I provided for this week's program details an interesting homegrown effort by a man who was a young boy during those riots, making an effort to enhance the remembrance and reconciliation needed in the aftermath of this tragic event. He's placing flowers, erecting handmade signs at a cemetery to mark the loss of those two innocent victims of racial violence. In 1989, in Philadelphia, long simmering tension between the police and the radical African-American group MOVE came to a head. During a police attack, a helicopter dropped a bomb on the MOVE compound in a poor black section of Philadelphia. The resulting fire, you can see the smoldering remains there on the left, destroyed 65 houses, killed 6 members of the radical MOVE group, along with 5 of their children. The survivors and the displaced residents later received $14 million in compensation from the city of Philadelphia. Pennsylvanians have also suffered at the hands of Mother Nature. I know this personally because my in-laws were victims of flooding on several occasions, and the worst of those incidents occurred in 1972. Hurricane Agnes brought disaster to mostly the central and north-central parts of the state. Hit with about 10 inches of rainfall in a very short period. Schuylkill County, north of here, reported 19 inches of rain. The worst flooding was on the Susquehanna River and in the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton area, there, the east branch of the Susquehanna. Much of Harrisburg itself, along the main channel of the Susquehanna, was underwater, including the governor's mansion, shown there on the right. As a result of Hurricane Agnes, 68,000 homes were destroyed, 220,000 people left homeless, and 50 Pennsylvania residents lost their lives. In 1979, technology joined the list of Pennsylvania nemeses. Pennsylvania, of course, was a pioneer in the peaceful development of nuclear energy. Shippingport near Pittsburgh was the site of the nation's first commercial nuclear power plant in 1957. The 3 Mile Island generating station outside Harrisburg reflected the promise of nuclear power when it opened in 1974. But 5 years later, calamity struck, eerily echoing a movie that had opened just 2 weeks before, The China Syndrome, denounced at the time by the nuclear power industry as sheer fiction. Well, fiction became reality. A maintenance worker accidentally shut off the water supply to one of the 2 reactors at TMI. The reactor shut down, a relief valve opened, as it was supposed to do, but it stuck open, and millions of gallons of radioactive cooling water poured out, exposing part of the reactor core. As heat built up, the plant came within 2 hours of a total meltdown. Governor Dick Thornburgh, he's shown there on the left, visiting the site with President Carter, ordered pregnant women and children living within 5 miles of TMI to evacuate. 200,000 eventually fled their homes in fear, but fortunately scientists later discovered no long-term health effects from the accident. However, it did spark widespread anti-nuclear protests, like that shown on the right. These contributed to a growing lack of public confidence and investor support for nuclear power. The one undamaged reactor at TMI continued to operate until last year, and the plant is now in the process of being decontaminated and mothballed. The start of the 21st century saw a national tragedy enacted in the skies over Pennsylvania, the hijacking of United Flight 93 on September 11, 2001. As the plane was diverted and sent probably in the direction of the U.S. Capitol. Passengers and crew attacked the hijackers, forced the plane down in Somerset County near Shanksville, making this the first battle in a now 2-decade-long fight against Islamist terrorism. The 40 victims on board the aircraft are honored at the Flight 93 National Memorial Site. Their names are inscribed on the wall, shown at the left, which follows the flight path of the doomed aircraft. And on the right, you can see the Tower of Voices, where 40 wind chimes serve as a gentle but persistent reminder of the sacrifice that took place on this hallowed ground. Well, let's leave our traumas and troubles behind us for a minute. Take a look at some of the bright spots in Pennsylvania culture over the last 75 years. I'm sure many of these will resonate with my viewers today. We'll start with some made in Pennsylvania products that have brought joy to our lives and the grandkids as well. In the middle are those ubiquitous Victorian Christmas carolers from Buyer's Choice, handmade in Bucks County since 1978. My wife will soon be bringing out the entire collection, including the pet dog singing at the feet of the carolers. The slinky on the left was invented during World War II by a naval engineer in Philadelphia. His name was Richard James. He sold his first slinky to rave reviews at Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia in 1945. Richard James later became a missionary in Bolivia. His wife Betty took over the family company, and in 1964 she moved it to Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, where slinkies are still produced. Crayola crayons on the right originated with a company in Easton, Pennsylvania, Binney and Smith, in 1903. I chose the 64 box of crayons to show here. My favorite as a kid, introduced in 1958. Incredible array of artistic choices there. Over the years, Crayola has offered over 600 different colors. 120 of them are available at any given time. However, as cultural sensitivities have advanced over the years, some of the colors have changed their names. Flesh is now peach, Indian red is now known as chestnut red, and Prussian blue, since nobody remembers who or what a Prussian is, Prussian blue is now known as midnight blue. On the sports front, Little League Baseball was created in Pennsylvania. It began in 1939 as a small league of 3 teams in Williamsport. In fact, the founder of Little League Baseball, Carl Stutz, lived a block from me when I was growing up. Little League grew to become the world's largest organized youth sports program. And the World Series is still played in Williamsport each year, or I should say it's actually played in South Williamsport. The last Pennsylvania team to win the series was Levittown in 1960, shown there in the photograph on the left. And of course, a historic moment there on the right. Jason Kelsey, center for the Philadelphia Eagles, dressed up as a mummer in the parade honoring the Eagles after their only Super Bowl win in 2018. I'm an Eagles fan, and considering the team's well-known reputation for disappointing its fans, it's not likely we'll see this historic event repeated anytime soon. Here are 2 Pennsylvania champions from the music world. Marian Anderson was born in Philadelphia in 1897, got her start singing in a church choir at the age of 6. With the Philadelphia Music Academy closed to African American students, she got support from the city's black churches to enable her to take private vocal lessons. Her career took off in Europe, then in America, famously in 1939, after the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow her to perform in Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., Eleanor Roosevelt arranged for her to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. In 1955, she became the first African American to perform at the Metropolitan Opera. And she also sang on occasion with the Philadelphia Orchestra under its renowned music director, Eugene Ormandy. The orchestra was founded in 1900, remains one of the big five of American orchestras, and Ormandy's 44-year tenure in Philadelphia, one of the longest at a single orchestra for any conductor. Many icons of popular music have ties to Pennsylvania. You can probably think of about a dozen right now without me bringing them up. But I do want to mention Dick Clark. Although he was born in New York, he won fame in Philadelphia, where he debuted as host of American Bandstand in 1956. This hit TV program introduced rock and roll to America, gave many new artists their first exposure to a national audience, including Prince, Stevie Wonder, Simon and Garfunkel, and Madonna. Not in Philadelphia. By then, in later years, the show had moved to California. But in its heyday, American Bandstand was noted for featuring blacks and whites performing and dancing together, a very radical notion in the late 50s, early 60s. Now, the young soldier at the right is none other than Bobby Rydell, born in Philadelphia, and as of 1960, when this photograph was taken, before he became a pop music star, he was serving part-time in the Pennsylvania National Guard. And this photograph shows him during his taking a break from his summer training at Fort Indiantown Gap in Lebanon County. I discovered this in the archives out at Fort Indiantown Gap. I can't tell you who his girlfriend was or why he has a bandage on his finger. Interesting historical conundrum there. We have Pittsburgh to thank for these two stars of the big and small screen. George Romero on the left was a cult filmmaker known for a string of gruesome horror movies about a zombie apocalypse. Some of his stars are shown here. Romero graduated from college in Pittsburgh in 1960, later relied on the Pittsburgh area to provide settings for some of his most famous movies, notably including The Night of the Living Dead, filmed in part at the Monroeville Mall outside Pittsburgh. Fred Rogers was born in Latrobe, outside Pittsburgh, was an ordained Presbyterian minister, then collaborated with a child psychologist to create Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in 1968. The show was produced by public station WQED in Pittsburgh, broadcast nationally on PBS, ran for 33 years, won critical acclaim for its sensitive handling of children's physical and emotional concerns. By coincidence, one of Romero's early film projects was a short segment from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, where Fred Rogers underwent a tonsillectomy. I like to think this may have been where Romero got his early interest in blood and gore. Pittsburgh also gave us Andy Warhol, not the traditional working class type, but his father was an immigrant coal miner from Slovakia. He started out as a commercial illustrator. He was a window decorator at Kaufman's department store in Pittsburgh for a time, then of course became a controversial proponent of pop art. His New York studio became a mecca for intellectuals, celebrities, drag queens, street people. His collection of friends and their outrageous lifestyle inspired him to popularize the expression 15 minutes of fame. Well, his fame is permanently enshrined at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, the largest museum in the U.S. devoted to the work of a single artist. In eastern Pennsylvania, the Wyeths made their mark on the world of American art. N.C. Wyeth was one of America's greatest commercial artists. Born in Massachusetts, he settled early on in Chadds Ford, southwest of Philadelphia. Among other works, he illustrated 112 books, countless magazine covers like the one shown on the left, created ads and posters for clients ranging from Coca-Cola to Lucky Strike cigarettes. His son Andrew followed in his father's realist footsteps. but focused on fine art. Born in Chadds Andrew Wyeth became one of America's best-known artists of the mid-20th century. His studio, of course, remains open to the public. One of his best-known images is Christina's World, shown here from 1948. Depicts a real woman, a neighbor of his, Christina Olson, unable to walk because of a rare undiagnosed neurological disorder. I already noted the decline of traditional industries in Pennsylvania, but in the last 20 years, there have been signs of an economic renaissance of sorts, especially in the old steel city of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is now becoming a booming center for education, healthcare, high tech. The University of Pittsburgh, for example, is a national leader in medical research and innovation, and it helps. Pennsylvania has an elderly population who are beneficiaries as well as research subjects for the work of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and many other providers. PPG Place rose up in the 1980s, headquarters of a company that had been known as Pittsburgh Plate Glass. It's referred to locally as the Glass Cathedral, and the site still thrives on the commitment of local businesses and investors to keep Pittsburgh one of the most livable big cities in the entire U.S. There's rebirth in eastern Pennsylvania as well. In Bethlehem, the ruins of the Bethlehem Steel Complex have been converted to steel stacks. This is the largest revitalized brownfield site in the country. Serves as a regional destination for arts and culture, a prime example of what community leaders refer to as heritage tourism. Concerts, classes, movies, festivals, not in the current COVID environment, but soon to begin again, taking place year-round in the shadow of these 100-year-old blast furnaces. Developments like this are inspiring new respect for Pennsylvania's past and new hope for its future. So I want to close by expressing my hope that all of us will soon have a chance to get out and experience Pennsylvania's past and its future for ourselves. That concludes my program for today, and I want to see if we have any questions, comments over the transom. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this 3-week exploration of the Keystone story. Next week, of course, is Thanksgiving week, and my topic will be the true story of Thanksgiving. Well, we'll talk about the legends too, but I am a historian, so we will ultimately get down to the truth about this day so important to Americans, annual ritual of family, food, faith, and football. So I hope you'll join me next week for a look at this uniquely American holiday, its history, traditions, and lasting meaning for Americans today. Again, thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.